would have taken exception were it my place to the adjective inflammatory applied wholesale to New Left literature outside the context of equally inflammatory ideology displayed in, say, Reader's Digest, with its historically inflammatory Cold War theory, or odd language about dope fiends, or the New York Daily News, which in editorials has proposed atom-bombing China, counting 200 million persons, at their own estimate is reasonable, or for that matter the New York Times, whose business-as-usual reportage in this era of planetary and ecological crisis occasionally inflames my own heart fantasies to arson. Be that as it may, it's just a minor quibble with your text, merely to say that I find above-ground language as often inflammatory as I find New Left underground rhetoric, as would W.C. Fields. And I thought that was a pretty pithy statement about their attitudes. How much is that? Just a couple more minutes?
Yeah,
like
2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Yep.
You know, I just want to mention that these papers endured widespread harassment. And, you know, on the one hand, it's true that salacious material was pretty commonplace in these papers. Maybe less so a little bit in the Great Speckled Bird than some other papers, but in the big cities you had, you know, naked women and four-letter words, and you had these underground comics that were, you know, they were frankly meant to be offensive to people in the dominant culture. But, you know, all this material should have been, you know, constitutionally protected. It was all social writing in the broadest sense. And at the same time, you know, these papers just endured an incredible amount of harassment. The effort was largely uncoordinated. There was no one group that, you know, set out to destroy the underground press, but the FBI was involved. The FBI would monitor these papers. They actually started 2 fake underground publications. They were more like newsletters, but the idea was to promote, you know, moderate views as opposed to radical ones on campus and trick people. Someone, this is the true story, someone had figured out that they could create this foul-smelling chemical that smelled like feces, and they were going to spray it on the bundles of these papers at the distribution center so that they couldn't be used. They would go after printers and advertisers and lean on them and tell them to not do business with these people. They would harass the street vendors who, you know, sold them on corners and whatnot. I haven't found a, you know, a single case and a single instance where any of these convictions, or arrests rather. Yeah, there were no convictions. I haven't found any, but the people were sort of arrested and harassed, and that effort was widespread. And I'll wrap up. I'll wrap it up. But thank you.
Well, I guess the fact that former staff members of the Great Speckled Bird can be introduced as distinguished guests at the Decatur Book Festival just goes to show that anybody can become respectable if you just hang on long enough. As many of you remember, the 60s, of course, was a period of great ferment. And there were different kinds of ferment going on in the 60s. First of all, there was the political ferment. The civil rights movement, above all, which kicked off a lot of the other movements, the anti-war movement, the student movements, the New Left, SDS, women's liberation, gay liberation, black power, brown power, and just on and on and on. And then on the other hand, there was the counterculture, the hippie scene, which was characterized by a widespread rejection of middle-class values and standards, new standards in clothes and personal appearance and personal hygiene, men growing long hair, women burning bras, widespread use of drugs, rock music, freer sexual attitudes, experiments in communal living, and all of these things of young people who are trying to find new ways to live. So you had these 2 different things going on, which of course often got intermingled in the 60s. The Bird was one of hundreds of papers around the country which grew out of these movements and then in turn helped these movements grow. The Bird grew out of a small anti-war weekly newsletter on the Emory campus, the Emory Herald Tribune, which was started by Tom and Stephanie Coffin and some other folks at Emory. They were later joined by other people like white civil rights workers from the Southern Student Organizing Committee, SOC, student activists, and others. And as this group expanded, the vision of what they wanted to do expanded from a campus newspaper to a citywide underground newspaper. As Randy mentioned, the name of the paper comes from Roy Acuff's song. Roy Acuff's song, in turn, comes from a book, a verse in the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament. The Bird was published from 1968 to 1976. It started with very modest beginnings. The first issue was an 8-page black and white bi-weekly. But within a very short time, the Bird had added color. It was weekly within 6 months. Within a couple of years, it was 28 to 32 pages per issue. And by 1970, with a circulation of 22,000, it was the largest circulation weekly in Georgia. And at its height, the Bird was able to pay full-time staff members salaries of up to $60 a week, plus whatever we could earn by selling the paper on the street. As opposed to the corporate media, which then and now tends to represent the views of the rich and the powerful, the Bird saw itself as being a voice for the voiceless, for African Americans who were fighting Jim Crow, for striking workers, Vietnamese peasants who were being murdered by American bombs and napalm, draft resistors, and anti-war GIs, women who were taking control of their own bodies, young people who were rejecting repressive middle-class culture and looking for new ways to live. The very first issue of the Bird set the tone for what was to come with a broadside attack on Ralph McGill, who was and still is an Atlanta icon. We attacked Ralph McGill for his support of the Vietnam War, right on the front page. And that was a sign of what was to come. Every Atlanta sacred cow took its fair share of abuse in the pages of the Bird. Coca-Cola was a target. Georgia Power, Atlanta Housing Authority, corruption in the Sam Massell administration. No sacred cow went ungored in the pages of the Bird. The Bird was eagerly embraced by a lot of people, liberals and progressives and activists who were trying to change the status quo in one way or another, and especially by young people. Young people were really on the march in the 60s. Young people were leaving small towns all over the country and going to the city. And when young people got to Atlanta, often their first stop was the birdhouse, where they could get 50 birds on consignment and go out on the street and sell them and pay for their first meal in Atlanta. But of course, the Bird also made many enemies. Religious traditionalists didn't like our uncensored prose, or our nude photos, or our scatological